Mr. President, Chancellor, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I have to confess it looked rather like a pulpit to me, and I very seldom get invited to talk from a pulpit, so I'm doubly grateful for this effect that I can speak to you from here. The title of my talk is fairly broad, vague, which is as well, because I very rarely stick to the script, and in order to deal with that problem I didn't bring one, so we'll take it from there. Before I start on the substance of my talk, which has been subject of some discussion today, where I was persuaded against my better judgment to show some pictures. People say that pictures say more than words. I wanted to say a few things about Kenya and my other careers, and then turn to the talk with pictures. Many of you have heard of Kenya recently, and you've heard about it in a very negative sense. We are allegedly a very dangerous place to visit. We have rebels and terrorists hiding under every bush, and that people are advised to stay well clear of Kenya. Yes, we have problems in Kenya, but perhaps in Finland you don't have problems, but most of the world has problems. And if you want to go to Kenya to see wildlife, or to go to conferences, you should feel free to do so. It's remarkably unchanged over the last 30 years. Yes, if you want to get kidnapped or have your heads cut off, we can give you some likely addresses where this can be facilitated. But I assure you, most of the places most of you would want to go to, such things don't happen and won't happen. And it's just sad that a country like Kenya should be subject to some of the negative publicity that is inevitably going to be developed around some of the appalling incidents that's happened in our country. They are appalling, they are tragic, they are worrisome, but Kenya is a big country, and most of Kenya doesn't suffer from those considerations, and it will continue, I think, to be a safe country from the average visitor, less safe if you're going off to try and negotiate with rebels, but most of you in this room at least, with possibly one or two exceptions, wouldn't be falling into that trap. The situation with wildlife, I know some of you want to hear me talk a little bit about conservation, is that the level of poaching of elephant has increased very dramatically in the last 10 years. Part of the problem has been the emergence of China as a significant economy, and there are now tens of millions of Chinese citizens who can actually afford to buy trinkets made from ivory. It's not unlike in the late 80s and early 90s when Japan had people who could buy ivory, and they were feeding a market that was insatiable in a sense, and prices rose. Today, Japan and Europe and America are not the main countries of concern, but certainly Southeast Asia is a problem. But I don't believe that the Chinese can't ultimately solve this problem by talking to their own people and reminding people that to wear ivory means an elephant has to die. I was recently in China, in Hong Kong actually, and we were to talk to a number of organizations, including some schools. And when we went to the schools, we were asked if we could avoid showing dead elephants, or elephants that had been slaughtered for their ivory. And I said, well, why would we want to avoid showing you such pictures? And they said, because the Chinese people will be very upset. Well, I said, I'll add some extra slides, because so they should be. And indeed, when we showed these slides of dead elephants, blood all over the place, tusks lying about, many in the audience at several schools burst into tears and became hysterical. But on inquiring why they would be hysterical, because they did not know that elephants had to die for them to wear ivory trinkets. And I think the process of information and the process of education is so terribly important. And I think public awareness and a public attitude to wildlife and wildlife products is probably considerably more important than fighting a war. Yes, you can shoot poachers and you can jail poachers, but as long as the market is lucrative, the trade will continue. And I suppose at the end of the day, the thing we should all hope for is that one day the nations of the world will come together and agree that no wildlife product, other than probably fish, should be taken from the wilds as a commercial commodity. Whether it's a rhinoceros or an elephant, an antelope or a lion, let the wild stay wild. We have so little left. And surely we got to the point in our civilization where we know that they're worthless and they should be treated as worthless and left with the original owners, the animals that wear them. So that is my ultimate objective in conservation, and having been asked last week to return to the Kenya Wildlife Service as chairman of the board, my hope is to use that position to revitalize an organization that will not specifically look to anti-poaching, but will look to promotion of a better understanding through education and publicity of the rights of wildlife, including elephants. And so that's my ultimate goal. But it wasn't for that topic that I was invited here. I was invited to give you some reflections on the story of human origins. I was born into a family that considered the search for our ancestor more important than anything else, possibly with the exception of the welfare of their dogs. But my parents had a complete and utter devotion to dogs and to fossils, and children seem to have come about, if not by mistake, on the basis that they would take care of themselves in some way. The initial involvement with my parents' work, I suppose looking back, would have been more fun had I had a sense of fun in those days. But the picture on the screen at the moment is a picture of some of the early expeditions, very simple Ford cars, frequently breaking down and getting stuck. As we went on, there was less and less evidence that my parents had any idea that children needed love or needed welfare, like water or things like that. And my brothers and I grew up with a very distinctive dislike for the idea of paleontology. I had a particularly negative moment when I was about 5 years old, and I was out with my parents, and they were digging up some bone that they thought was important. And I was near them and saying, as a 5-year-old would say, or 5-year-old boy, I should say, not girls, of course, but boy, say, when can we go home? You know, why is it so hot? And why are there so many flies? And my father said, just shut up. We're doing something important. Go and find your own bone. Well, that seemed to be a step in the right direction. So at least I could get out of sight. So I wandered off not very far, a few hundred meters away, and stumbled upon a piece of bone lying in the earth. And so I started to remove the earth the right way I'd been taught. And it seemed to be the underside of a jaw of a large animal. So I went on, and it was intriguing because I started to see teeth and started to see things. And I guess it must have been half an hour or so, and my father came and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I found my own bone, actually. Why don't you go away at this stage?" And he said, "Let me see it." My goodness, he said, "That's far too important for a boy to be excavating. Push off. We'll take you back for lunch." So I thought, this is no game for me to play. So anyway, that's how it all started. Became very aware of a discovery in 1949 when my mother discovered, you see, my mother the lady in front of the press. She had discovered a skull of a Miocene ape, about 17 million years old. At that time, it was the most complete skull of an ape called Proconsul africanus. It was put forward and hailed as the missing link. You'd be surprised how many links have been missing since, but it was the missing link. And she was flown to London with the skull to address the world's press, largely British, but it was nonetheless, it was the world's press, and she went off to do that. And I was again struck by how some silly piece of bone could create so much interest, and it all struck me as very odd. Then, 10 years later, in 1959, my mother again found a complete skull of a creature called Zinjanthropus. Now, you can't really see it there, I'll show you possibly later on, but Zinjanthropus was the first time they had found a complete skull of an early human ancestor. Now, at that stage, my parents had been working at Olduvai and been talking about giant animals, giant sheep-like, giant buffaloes. And so we assumed when they found this human ancestor, it would also be a giant. And so we had this vision, as did many people, that giantism may well have affected our ancestors. Remember, until this discovery was made in Tanzania at Olduvai, nobody had found a fossil human ancestor of any form in Kenya. So this was breaking news, brand new, very exciting stuff. They were living in very primitive conditions, but I was now, I think, 16, 15, and I went down there with some photographers and was able to actually watch them make these discoveries. 10 years later, in 1969, my wife, who's here tonight, and I discovered up at Lake Turkana another skull similar to the one they had found in 59 of Zinjanthropus, this time absolutely complete. And you can see I was considerably younger and possibly better looking than I am today. But with me there is my father in the white shirt, Professor Raymond Dart, who is the doyen of paleoanthropology in southern Africa, and myself as a sort of upstart youngster hoping to do well. And I had the privilege of both watching these two giants talk about fossils, but the pleasure of realizing that they were talking about fossils that I had found, which added considerably to my self-confidence. And Professor Dart and my father really enjoyed seeing some material here that's quite complete. And here you see my mother on the extreme right, I think it is on that slide, and myself in the yellow shirt, Professor Raymond Dart in the middle, my father in the white shirt, Mrs. Dart, and behind that my young wife, who was there in long hair and a pretty dress. And this was the sum total of the fossil evidence in 1970. And you can see why some of our critics were saying, well, there's no evidence really for human evolution. They wouldn't take up more space than half a card table. And well, yes, it's about right. They didn't take up very much space, and none of these things on the table here were actually anything to do with us. They turned out to be ancestors off on a sideline, the Australopithecines, which have held sway in popular literature, but nonetheless irrelevant to our story. But in 1970, this was a huge thing for me. It began my career. I had the pleasure as a young man of watching my father again, and on the extreme left, Professor Camille Allenbourg, who was the French doyen of archaeology and paleontology, and somebody under the hat who I can't recognize, but was probably Clark Howell, who was the doyen of American paleoanthropology, doing things which are still done today, and that's using stone tools that they made to butcher the carcass of a goat. And yes, with stone tools, you can cut through flesh, you can dismember bones, and you can do a lot of things. And they were, if you like, forerunners of proving that with primitive stone implements, you can actually make a survival, which is different from what people had hitherto felt, certainly before the work at Olduvai had established an early age for stone implements at 1.8 million years. Well, these 1.8 million years old tools, while strikingly efficient, were rather boring looking things. Anyone can make them. And if this was the birth of technology, just 1.8 million years, well, okay. But ever since then, people have been scrambling to find even earlier evidence of technology and find out who actually made the tools. And it's quite important to realize that the making of a stone implement is quite a complicated issue in the sense that you've got to see what you want in the stone before you pick up the stone to break it, because you can't get a finished object that fits a pattern that you've made before unless the stone itself has it within it to give up that shape. And you need to pick up a stone that hasn't got natural fractures that will prevent you making the exact shape that you want to do. And it's quite clear that 1.8 million years, somebody, they called it Homo habilis at that time, separate from the Australopithecus, was actually making regularly stone tools, and they were finding these stone tools amongst animal bones that showed clearly that the bones had been defleshed with something sharp, and there were cut marks, and there was obvious evidence of these stones being used in butchery. So that was quite good, interesting. My mother found at Olduvai the remnants of a circle where stones were actually piled one on top of the other. And she believed, and I think she was right, that this was evidence of an abandoned hut base where they had tried to make a shade. They'd taken branches and boughs of trees, but the ground was very hard because the rock was just underneath the topsoil, and they couldn't get these wretched branches into the ground, and so they took stones and they piled them up around the base of the branches, so they got a cover, and presumably they would have put animal hides or things over it, and they had a little hut, which they obviously used at certain stages. We don't know whether it was day or night or both or what was going on. But she proposed that this was the first evidence of a human structure that people lived in. Well, this set off an uproar of doubt. She was roundly criticized for her vivid imagination, and that people 1.8 million years ago were stupid and couldn't possibly have made huts, despite the fact that countless birds make huts of one kind or another on a very intricate basis. Most insects make nests of one kind or another. Chimpanzees make nests, gorillas make nests, orangutans make nests, but our ancestors were too stupid. Well, that's the problem of being Homo sapiens. We're very arrogant. It turns out that they were indeed making a stone circle to make a hut. But at that time, this is unthinkable. Now, the discovery of Zinjanthropus, or Australopithecus boisei, which you see here, my mother working on, and my father trying to look as if he was working on, but I think he was resting next to her, was important for lots of reasons. I did say that it didn't lead to us, but what it did do was provide the very first evidence of a fossil ancestor that could be accurately dated. Up until this time, it was assumed that these creatures had been living about 500,000 years ago. And to now get the volcanic ash above this discovery and to get it dated through radiometric techniques or isotope techniques on the potassium argon concept gave a date of 1.75 million years. And suddenly, in 1960, the world news was that man's age pushed back to almost 2 million years. Well, yes, I suppose in 1960 that was pretty remarkable. And it certainly is a moment in my life that I remember very, very clearly. And so the work went on and various things happened. In 1964, having absolutely had nothing to do with prehistory and being offended by the idea that I would want to look for fossils myself, I succumbed and went off to look for fossils. And I went to a place in Tanzania west of Lake Natron, and my colleague, young Kamoya Kemeo, who worked with me for many years after and found many things, including Turkana Boy, he spotted a complete lower jaw of the same sort of creature that my mother had found at Olduvai, Australopithecus boisei. And it created huge excitement and some irritation, because this was the first time I had gone off to look for fossils, and I had found one in the first week. And my parents had worked for 30 years and hadn't found any initially. So this didn't do familial relationships much good. But I was told that I had a particularly good hand at organizing expeditions, and that I could go on organizing food and logistics, but they would bring in some scientists to do the work. Okay. So when the first paper was published on my find, I was faithfully recognized in the acknowledgements as having done a wonderful job with supplies. And I thought, this is not the right career for me. But I had dropped out of high school. I never went to college. I had no option of going back to college, having done very badly in high school. And so I was rather stuck with the situation, and I was largely responsible for creating. And then in 1967, my father sent me off to Ethiopia to join an international expedition to look in the Omo Valley for fossils. I went with a group from France, a group from Ethiopia, a group from America, and we had a small contingent from Kenya, which is basically myself, a couple of friends, and some Kenyan field workers. And we were given an area across the river, but we had to get across the river with our vehicles, so this was a sort of Boy Scout expedition. Build a ferry, get vehicles across, face dangerous crocodiles, deal with all these terrible things. It was fun. I enjoyed it. And then we, early on, discovered this skull and one like it, and I was so terribly excited by my discovery that I sent a message, and my father came up with my mother and Professor Arambo, who I introduced you to later, the doyens. Said, well, look, you know, my luck hasn't run out at all. I've got another skull so quickly. But they said, you know, good boy, but this is not an Australopithecine. This is not an ancestor. This is a modern human. You've wasted our time and money. Well, I thought, that's not very fair. I've worked so hard. Found a skull that is very fossilized. I thought it was very old. But anyway, I was given a fairly sound scolding, wasting Daddy's money, and I was sent off to look for something older. It turns out that this skull is the oldest record of Homo sapiens yet known. It was dated long after my father died, but it's about 198,000 years before present, predates Neanderthal, and is one of the earliest records of an anatomically modern human. We found another one, and it is now of huge interest to everybody to know what a fully modern, anatomically modern group of people were doing wandering around even before Neanderthal appeared on the scene. And so in terms of genetics, in terms of things that we're now doing, it's particularly interesting to know of the existence of anatomically modern humans 200,000 years ago. I would predict they'll go further back than that, but this is my foray into this, and once again I got parental scolding for wasting their money. So many things happened in the interim, and in 1984, at this site, which you see on the screen at the moment, not a very good picture, but we screened away the earth, one of my colleagues who had found that jaw in 1964, Kamoya, discovered a little piece of skull about the size of maybe 4 centimeters by 3 centimeters of a human skull. Not very intriguing, but clearly a human skull because of the sutures. And so the protocol is, if you find a human remain in deposits that are old, you screen. You put a sieve and you push the earth through fine mesh, and you separate out soil from bone, and you can pick up some additional pieces. So we did some initial screening, and I think rather hoped that we would find nothing because we wanted to go somewhere else. And clearly if you find more, you stay longer and you spend more time, and it was at the time not a great discovery, and at the time not something we wanted to do much more time with. But you'll see in front of the guy with the white shirt, there's a tiny little thorn tree with a water bag hanging underneath. It's hardly visible as a tree, but it was a teeny bit of shade. And here's that same tree, and there's me trying to get what little shade was left on the excavation. As leader, I had to have the best spot. But it was chosen not for the likelihood of new discoveries, but for the possibility of some extra shade. And underneath the roots of this tree, I found both sides of the face of a Homo erectus. Later, when we excavated further, we started to find the whole skeleton. And it appears what happened was this skull was embedded, entombed in this earth 1.6 million years ago. And as the erosion on the slope cut back, rainfall started seeping into the ground near the surface, and a lot of rainfall got into the skull, which was lying upside down, and a seed of a tree got into the skull and germinated. And in the process, pushed up the bits of the skull above the roots, and that's what we initially found, leaving the face underneath the roots. And so whilst getting the shade, and I was trying to be diligent and show I was working, I found the key to the whole find, which was the two sides of the face and the palate. As you see later, we did the excavation, we found the skeleton, and these pictures show you the distribution after 3 years of work of where the skeleton had been lying. And it was clear that this individual had died in a swamp, and that water action had winnowed and sorted the bones, and we happened to come down on it and uncover it, so we got the virtually an entire skeleton laid out. And there you see the skeleton of Turkana boy, Homo erectus, at 1.6 million years. Several people have asked me, even here in Helsinki, whether or not this was a sort of eureka moment. Well, it wasn't eureka because it went over for 3 years, and eureka is supposed to happen quickly. And we didn't get that feeling at all at the time, but it was obvious as we went on that we were going to find some wonderful stuff. And now we built a monument at the site, which was opened 2 months ago, where there's a monolith and a bronze cast of the complete skeleton as a sort of place that people could go and see and ruminate and speculate about the African ancestry of themselves. And this is now becoming quite a feature in the Lake Turkana area, and it's just been up for, as I said, 2 months. But anyway, so let's then go on and say, since Turkana boy, contemporary work on genetics and the unraveling of the genome has shown that whether we like it, and most do, but whether we don't and some don't, we are all descended from a population that came out somewhere from northeast Africa between 250 and 100,000 years ago. We are all closely related to a very small population that was in Africa. There have been earlier migrations of Homo erectus, but the genetics suggest that every single living person can trace their roots back to a point very close to where we found the Turkana boy. This is not to suggest that Turkana boy has some special relationship to us, but it is interesting that it again comes out of Africa. And the genetics are very clear about that possibility. And so, partly as a result of the genetic work and partly as a result of other things, I thought living in tents and working under the conditions that my parents worked under and having the difficulty of logistics, I would use the success of our work to build a couple of institutes. And this is Lake Turkana in northern Kenya. The lake is about 250 kilometers in length. It's the biggest lake in Africa. It's a desert lake, slightly brackish. And we have built it on the left-hand side of the stream, TBI Turkwell, and on the right-hand side of the stream, TBI Ylrë. And these are research facilities now that are open to many different people, and we have collaboration, as we've said earlier in the introduction, with this university and with students and professors from here who are now using these facilities to develop programs directly or indirectly related to the story of human origin. And we've got decent buildings, we've got decent facilities, museum specimens properly stored, And we've got one on the east side, which I showed you, and another one on the west side. Quite extensive, substantial buildings with wonderful facilities for science and wonderful facilities for field schools. We get students from not just America. We've actually had some young people from Helsinki come out and participate in 3 months of education, learning about geology, paleoecology, anthropology, and related sciences. And they get a pretty good work through of what it takes to be a prehistorian working on human origins. And I think it's a great connection between what we're doing and what's being done in other universities, and I'm particularly glad to acknowledge the role that is played through the participation of Helsinki. And Mikael Fotelis is the engineer of this exercise, and we signed a memorandum of understanding with Helsinki a couple of years ago, and the cooperation is growing quite rapidly, and I'm very pleased about that. Students are taught to do some of those things. You saw my father and Aronborg napping stone so they could open up the entrails of the goat and cut flesh. We teach the students to do the same thing, and we get young professors coming in and acting as if they just discovered the idea, but it goes back some time. But clearly, the use of stone is very important. We have scientific seminars with colleagues coming in from many parts of the world, discussing all sorts of different things, not just the finer detail of what these things may mean, but actually discussing obtuse issues. And our next discussion that we will be having at Turkana is to take scientists who study behavior, primate behavior in particular, as well as anatomists who study humans and human brains, and see if there's anything in the fossil skulls that would tell us, is there something there that tells you about tool making? Because we now have stone tools going back to 3.4 million years. Remember, I was talking about 1.8. Well, it's been pushed back beyond 3.3. Cut bone goes back to about 3.5. And it's very apparent that the threshold of that side of behavior is probably much earlier than any of us thought. And so seminars of that kind are a pretty important part of what TBI is doing. We're also now able to help the community where we're working, and we have, a few years ago, put in a mobile clinic where we have a fully qualified, fully employed nurse who goes around with this vehicle and does basically inoculations as well as treatment. And we are covering tens of thousands of people who normally have no access to modern medicine. It's very simple, but it's making a huge difference. And our Ministry of Health recognized that this clinic has probably inoculated more people in 1 year than the government had inoculated in the previous 10 years. So that's a very good indicator of the efficiency of what this is doing. It also gives the community a sense that we're not just collecting the bones, but we're actually doing something for the people whose area the bones are being collected. And I think this is something quite important. Now, moving forwards, education is central. My daughter Louise has developed some IT work. One of the things she's done is established a virtual museum where you can visit the site and you can actually go in and pick up skulls and turn them around and go to where the skulls came from, go to the drawers. And kids in Finland, kids in America, kids in Canada, kids in South Africa now have an opportunity to get a sort of as close to a virtual experience of these fossils and their differences as you could possibly hope for. And this to me is a very exciting thing, because I think one of the problems with proselytizing about the story of origins is that very few people hear you because they have no access. And so getting acceptable access through the virtual world is something that I think is critical, and my daughter is playing a very significant role. One of the other things she's doing is got a program now where you can download the program and you can create with cardboard, your own skulls. And you can go to the virtual museum, you can see a skull you want, the teacher can take those skulls and cut with a computer program the things that you want. The kids can place them all together because they're numerically ordered, and you can end up with all sorts of skulls of actual specimens, and the kids can A, assemble them, and B, discuss the differences between them. And this seems to me a very important enrichment of the science. And here you see a granddaughter on the right in the blue shirt, and a colleague who's working with us actually piecing together these fossils with huge, I think, excitement that from a piece of paper you can actually make a skull that is relevant to human evolution, and the stories that go with that is obviously of great importance. So I think that's sort of, if you like, where the science is going. We need to popularize and talk much more about it. But I suppose having said that, there's some other issues that we need to think about. I think knowing that we are all African is quite important. Some people don't think it is, but if you take the state of the world today, I think to some people it's rather a shocker to believe that less than 60,000 years ago you were in Africa, and that your ancestors were probably black until about 10,000 years ago. And the reason we know that is that the genealogy, the genes have been worked out, and the trip switch that causes light colour is a very recent phenomenon. Blue eyes even more recently, so I'm sorry, Scandinavians. You're not the norm. You're the oddity. And you really do have an African origin. It is quite recent indeed. And I think that in itself is important, not just for people outside Africa, but very important for people within Africa. African people, as you know, have been traumatized through the slave trade, through colonization, through whatever the polite word to call it is, but distribution of wealth problems and exploitation through corporates trying to now gain access to raw materials. And many Africans feel very, very put out by the fact that they've had the thin end of the wedge for so long. But if we can show beyond doubt that Africans actually are not the thin end of the wedge, but the seed from which humanity grew, this can change attitudes very dramatically, very quickly. And I know that the Chinese have been trying to produce evidence that we all came from China, but I think we may have persuaded them not to speak so loudly, because the Chinese came from Africa. There are other people, some Europeans, who believe that Homo erectus is a European phenomenon, went down to Africa. They were here about 1.6 million years ago, but they seem to have come from somewhere else. The technology in Europe at the most is about 1.5 million years. The technology in Africa is about 3.3. There are lots of lines of evidence, and then you cap it all with a good understanding of genetics today, which does tell the same story. And you find that although previous populations have moved in and out of Africa, we all, this room, from southern tip of Southern America to the middle of Australia, we are all taking our genetics component from a small population that first left Africa just 65,000 years ago. Now you can stamp your feet and grind your teeth, but that's how it is. And I think we need to get past that prejudice and get past the fact that the inconvenient truth isn't sometimes initially sweet, but it can be turned into something very, very exciting and very positive. Now, in order to do more than I have done, and in order to, if you like, take the whole issue further, many people have asked me, what more can we do other than find more fossils, unravel more genetic stories, collect more artifacts, push back the age even further? Well, let's start with the beginning. We don't know when our first ancestors walked on two legs. We know that they were walking on two legs 4.5 million years ago, and my wife found evidence for that some years back in terms of some postcranial bones. My mother found some evidence of footprints dating to 3¾ million years, and there's no doubt that from 4.5, an ape was walking around quite happily just using 2 legs. Now, we don't have much anatomical evidence in terms of fossil bones yet, but there is some. How much further back does it go? Will it go back to 10 or 15, or will it just seem to start quite close to where we are? And the guessing is that we will probably find the ancestors of bipedal locomotion at about 6, maybe 7. But we haven't got the bones yet. So one of the priorities in research in Africa today is to find sites that are the right age to see if we can ascertain whether 6 million years ago there was a 2-legged ape. A 2-legged ape isn't a human, but there would be no human if there hadn't been a 2-legged ape. So we've got to start somewhere. So I think that's one thing. Secondly, we need to understand or find evidence that would indicate what pressures brought about bipedalism. It's a very strange thing to do, to walk around on 2 legs. Your guts don't hang nicely in the basket. They're sort of trying to fall out all the time, some of you know. Whereas something on 4 legs has a nice bag, all your innards fit in the bag, and you can walk along over rough ground and it doesn't hurt so much. Your back, as you know, as you get older, doesn't do very well on 2 legs. It probably would have preferred 4. As I learned to my cost, if you've only got 2 legs and you lose one or both, you've had it, unless somebody looks after you. And I never really thought about that. It's obviously obvious to anyone. But even if you only have 1 leg, you still can't cope as a human unless somebody cares for you. Because I tried, they gave me my first artificial leg while the other one was by no means ready to take an artificial leg. I couldn't do a damn thing. I might have had no legs, as I did. So bipedalism has put some enormous pressures on us, and what would have caused it? What would be the environmental stimulus to force this change? Clearly it was environmental, and almost certainly it was dietary. And dietary pressure brings about most significant evolutionary change in organisms, survival. And it's not survival of the fittest in the sense that we're strong and brawny and beat each other to death if we get a chance, but fittest in the sense we've got enough food to reproduce. And it's very difficult to reproduce if you've got no food. I would suggest you try it, but you must have heard of these phenomena. Reproductive health does require a balanced and sensible diet. And so we don't have the answer to that question. Everything I'm saying is speculative, but that is a question that can be answered. We can now understand paleo-environments, we can understand paleoclimates, we can find fossils, and we can begin to take a crack at this over the next decade. So I think that's the next big step. What on earth led to making of stone implements? It's an unlikely thing to do is carry a heavy stone and find another stone and break them up into bits so that you can do something with it. But the chances are that when the climate change brought about the opening up of Eastern Africa in terms of savannas, there was quite a lot of protein from the kills left by other animals, carnivores. There wasn't that much carbohydrate because there was very little fruit in the savanna trees and very little else they could eat. You get tubers, and you could find dried meat from animal carcasses. But with these stupid human teeth, you can't do much with dried meat. You break your teeth up if you start chewing on a piece of cartilage from a wildebeest or an elephant. But if you could take a piece of cartilage or piece of dried skin and you can pound it with a big rock on another rock, you can actually render it to some sort of mush powder, mixed with water, or even chew it in smaller pieces, and you can live. And so I can envisage sometime earlier than 3.5 million years ago, these early people living on the savannah found that they could bash these rocks and produce a reasonable basis of food, but then periodically they'd bash the rock too hard and it would break. And they'd get something sharp, maybe you cut your finger or cut your hand with a sharp stone. And it doesn't take genius to realize if you can cut your hand, you can cut some flesh off something else. And I think the transition to breaking rocks accidentally to breaking rocks deliberately is very plausible. And I think this happened between 3.5 and 4 million years ago would be my guess, but it came about in a serendipitous way because they were using rocks to pound rather than to cut. And it was the byproduct of pounding that led to sharp flakes, and the byproduct of flakes that led to being able to cut fresh meat as opposed to gristle and tendons of carcasses. So I think that's another frontier that paleoanthropology needs to deal with. I think going further down or further towards current time, we need to understand what this Homo thing is about, our genus. We call ourselves Homo sapiens, doesn't matter whether we're sapient or not. But we have a big brain compared to other primates relative to body size. We are allegedly very much more intelligent than our closest relatives, who are quite smart, by the way. So what would have led to the increasing growth of the skull on a relatively modest body, and what was driving that? Well, obviously, selection for behavior would have been important. But the curious thing, as you all know, is that if you're going to be upright, your baby has to pass through a birth canal that is the girdle that supports you in upright posture. And if you need a large head in adulthood, you're going to need a fairly large head when you're born. Otherwise, in the old days, babe doesn't come out and mother doesn't survive. Caesareans are a recent phenomenon that they didn't have. So it seems that what happened is some form of selection was put on early Homo for delayed infancy, so that the infant, when born, is still in a fetal state. And human babies come out long before they should. They're useless, as you know, pieces of putty. They couldn't hang on to their mother if they tried. And so they put an enormous burden on the mother, because the mother has to hold on to this wretched thing to go from A to B. And if you're living in the wilds with lions and dangerous animals, it's a huge handicap. And so having to nurture for the first 3 or 4 years, because human babies are so utterly inept at looking after themselves compared to a chimpanzee or a gorilla or a monkey. You know, a chimpanzee baby can cling on to mother after just a couple of days. If mother has to climb a tree, it hasn't got time to hang on to the baby hangs on to mother. Just a few days. But if any of you have had children, you can remember. If any of you have got children, if you want to try it, see. If you're going to have children, experiment and see how well the baby can hang on to you. If you've got no clothes on and you stand up, it's going to go straight onto the floor, which is not a selective advantage for this business. So what drove it? We don't know what drove it. But one of the advantages of a delayed infancy is there's a lot more time for mother and probably father, although this is perhaps not, I'm trying to be gender sensitive, but largely mother, to nurture the child, because the child is totally dependent on her. But the other side of that is dad, or if not dad, somebody who's closely connected, has a bonding to look after mum and child. And I'm not suggesting this is the beginning of a nuclear family, but an adult mum with an infant couldn't have survived unless somebody else was taking care of her. And so you get this social bonding quite early on as a result of having premature children that have to be nurtured for a long period of time. Well, if you have children around you for 3 or 4 years, you can teach them many things which you wouldn't if they were scampering around on their own looking after themselves. And so the formative years for human child or pre-human child would have been learning from mother in particular, but from parents, once they grew strong enough to participate in the group or family or whatever you want to call it. So there was a positive as well as a negative to having a big head in adulthood and inevitably a big head at birth. So that has to be looked at much more closely than we have, but what is very clear is that even Turkana boy probably had a birth that was premature and had to be looked after. And that we don't know exactly when the cutoff point was, but we need to find a lot more fossils that will answer those questions in terms of developmental biology and see where we are with all these things. And I think that will come. The issue of dating, aging these fossils is pretty well tidied up for the early fossils. Isotope dating using both potassium argon, but more likely argon-39 and argon-40, has gone afar. The dates that we're now using for these early ancestors are pretty close. When you say something is 3.3 million years old, it might be 3.3 plus or minus 10,000 years, but 10,000 years and 3.3 million years, it's okay. We don't have to be that specific. And in biological evolution, 10,000 years is long enough in a primate that has a long generation. So the dating is okay, but where we have a problem is that the younger fossils of Homo sapiens are very hard to date because they're too old for the standard carbon-14, and they're not old enough or found in places where you can do the potassium argon or the argon dating itself. And so there's a lot of work now being done on trying to age some of the critical fossils that are between 350 and 50,000 years. What caused 65,000 years ago a new group, a new migration out of Africa to now inhabit the rest of the world and wipe out their predecessors who have been all over the world, except America. They got to China, they got to Australia. What happened? What went through the mind of these guys 65,000 years ago? Say, well, let's expand again and wipe everything else out in the way. What was the pressure? Was it climatic? Or could it be something we can't get a handle on, like complex language? And complex language, cognitive language, conveys a huge advantage that grunts and so forth, or body language, don't necessarily convey. And if you could say, I'm going to meet you tomorrow afternoon under the bridge, provided the tide is in, you have a lot more information about planning your next day's work. You say, meet you by a river, or grunt, grunt, grunt. So I think cognitive, syntactical language tied to a complex brain probably gave a huge advantage. And could this be the magic that got the last population of Homo sapiens moving across Africa and across Europe and ultimately into Asia in the last 65,000 years? We don't know. But maybe if we do better genetic work and we get a better understanding of the genes, maybe we could find the things that weren't there and are there. We're beginning to get fossil DNA. Maybe there will be ways to look at that over the next decade. In any event, we knew very little. We know more, but not enough. But in talking to somebody yesterday about, you periodically shake the tree and cause confusion. Well, nobody wants to cause confusion. But the good thing is, even if you shake the tree very hard, as I've tried to do in my career, the tree's still standing. Evolution of humanity hasn't gone away. We are an evolved species. We are a complex biological phenomena that came out of an evolutionary template. Now, sort of to conclude, well, what does this do to Genesis? Oh dear, such a complicated subject. But let me just tell a little story that Mikhail actually introduced me to. Some people in America did a study. As you know, biblically, God created Adam, and then Adam was used to create Eve. N'est-ce pas? You remember? I don't, but I was told that. And what was used was a rib. And they meant a rib, costal rib. Well, a rib isn't likely to produce anything if you think about it. It's not a very effective source of production. And if you look around you, or you want to feel later, men and women have exactly the same number of ribs, and you can run your fingers through like a piano key, and you'll find that boys and girls have the same number of ribs. So that's a bit of a disappointment for Genesis. Well, if you look at it more closely, and this is what Mikhail pointed out to me, and I'm going to go into very, very briefly. First of all, we assume the word rib used today is the same word that was used then to describe something. If you go back into the history of Hebrew history and early Testament language, a rib was a support structure. You could have a rib on a building, you could have a rib on a boat, you could have a rib on a tree. There are all sorts of ribs as well as these. And these are probably the minor part of being a rib. So, it may not have been a rib, but what was it then that was taken from males to create females? The one thing, gentlemen, you don't have, and no other gentleman or aspiring gentleman has, is an os baculum. And an os baculum is a bony structure in the penis. Chimpanzees, gorillas, monkeys, lions, leopard, tigers, horses, donkeys, everybody has the os baculum except male humans. That structure of rigidity was removed from us to create the gender sitting next to some of you. Now, as you get older, you realize that wasn't very fair. And I'll leave it there and take a few questions and then stop it. Thank you. Now, I was told firmly there would be no questions, and being me, I said nonsense, there will be some questions. So let us take 10 short minutes. I promise not to go over 10 minutes, but if there are none, that's fine for the organisers. If there's some, it's also fine, but just 10 minutes. Who'd like to start? Don't be shy. Elephants, rhino, yes, speak up.
Kenya is our missing link, and some other anthropologists think that Australopithecus africanus is our missing link. How do you think?
Well, first of all, I would disregard anyone who claims to find a missing link. Evolution doesn't happen in a chain-like way, and basically ideas in people's heads. There's a grand idea that leads to this missing link. And the link is supposed to be a link between humans and apes. But my friends, who did the classification if it wasn't humans? We are apes. We haven't separated, we're just different. And so there can't be a link you can find that'll separate you from the apes. There are things we do that other apes don't do as well, including come to lectures in Helsinki. But there's not a missing link, and there never will be a missing link except in the heads of anthropologists. And I'm afraid common experience suggests there are an awful lot of links missing in most of them. Next one. Here's one on this side here. If there's a microphone coming so people can hear.
So much of your work seems to depend on finding fossils. Can you still continue finding more, or are you afraid of running out of them?
Do you know, let me explain to you. Fossils are found as a result of erosion over geological deposits that they were fossilized in. Erosion is a continuing process. There could be a critical fossil to answer some of the questions, or many of the questions, that is currently 2 centimeters below the surface. We won't see it. If we have a major storm and come back next year, you might find it. We will continue to find fossils forever because there are vast areas where they must exist underground and we won't see them until they're exposed. So there's absolutely no prospect of running out of fossils. Running out of ideas, maybe, but not fossils. Plenty. Yes, there's a question at the back there. In the middle, not the back, a lady.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you very much because you have been your statement on violence. I was there in Sevilla to draft the drafting conference, and you didn't came there because you were too busy. But your name is there as one of those signatures for the statement saying that the human is not the warlike by nature. And my question is, you still think like that? That human nature is basically for peace and compassion?
Well, let me put it this way. I did write and sign that statement that we were not naturally violent. I think the fine print would have said, but capable of extraordinary violence. I think to say we are a species of peace is equally misleading, because what is peace? I think basically our problem is that we can be led this way or the other way. And I think some of the greatest crimes against humanity have been in the name of finding peace. Some of the claims that we are very, very socially close bonded species, indeed, unless we get persuaded young people to get together in a social unit and kill, we wouldn't fight wars. So we are social, but I think we've reached the stage in our knowledge and education to realize that we are not pre-programmed on such issues. We should have the sensitivity and the awareness to make judgments about what is right and wrong. But as somebody said to me, and I think they're right, if you're up against an enemy who has no intention of being peaceful, because they don't believe that's their calling from God, do you wait to have your head cut off? Or do you try to stop it being cut off by stopping the people who would cut it off? Now, that's the dilemma that we as people and we as leaders have to face. And you know, we talk about war and all its evils. They don't get less evil because we understand them. But we have to recognize that to be peaceful, you have to have constraints on what people can do. And those constraints mustn't be pacifist. They need to be very clear. There's certain lines, like with children, there's certain lines, you don't cross those. If you do cross those lines, there's a consequence. I'm all for peace. We all are for peace. But sometimes you cannot sustain your peace because others have no intention of letting you. And so it's more complex than I perhaps thought when I signed the statement. Thank you. Yes, this young lady right in front here.
I come from automation technology field, and well, partly because of Jurassic Park's 3D printing scene, and I was very happy to see that 3D printing parts. How do you feel technology can advance in your field and in science generally?
Technology has a very important role to play in science, particularly in the science we're in, but it'll be different from us to medical science, to travel science, to energy science. The application of increased knowledge through technology is phenomenal. And people say, why do I support space travel? I support space travel because the technology is used to dock in space and do the things like put a rover on Mars. My goodness, the byproducts of that in terms of technological knowledge can only help us. And we should never be afraid of looking for new knowledge. We must be afraid of the misuse of that knowledge. So I'm absolutely in favor of technology and science. The thing I'm against and will fight against as long as I stand is the people who believe that science and technology is in contradiction to their religious beliefs and demand that we teach science as an alternative only and not an explanation for life. That seems to me bad judgment, if not stupid. You can have as much faith as you want. If it makes you happy and gives you strength, fine. But don't replace a scientific understanding of life with a biblical or Quranic explanation for life. That's a mistake in my mind. Yes, there's one at the back there, and then we probably make that the last one. Yes, you speak up.
When did the right head arise?
When did they? Large head? Large hands? This hand?
Right hand.
Right hand.
Right hand.
Well, some of you know that horses seem to have right legs and that they prefer to jump off with. Most animals favour one side against another, not all. But right-handedness, I'm not sure what would cause it, but I think the answer is that some very good examples of humanity don't use their right hand. Some very good examples of humanity don't use their heads. So I don't think we should make it a criteria of being us. I think it's right-handedness. There's some people looking at stone tools now and trying to figure out whether in the tools you can see a manufacturing technique that is distinctive between a left-handed toolmaker and a right-handed toolmaker. And because they're starting from zero, they're having to get contemporary people to make tools who are left-handed and right-handed. I think from what I've seen, it's not much in it. But you know, right hands generally are stronger in many creatures, not just humans. But I don't think it's important in what we're doing. But you know, a strong hand is less important than a thumb that is opposable. You've got to be able to touch your fingers with your thumb. My poor lady wife lost the use of her thumb a few months ago in a boating accident. And so we were a family with only one right thumb, which is important, and only two good legs. But we survived. So thank you all very much. Thank you.